I open this hearing of the Senate Economics Legislation Committee into the National Housing and Homelessness Plan Bill 2024. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. The committee will be conducting today's hearing via video conference and in person. These are public proceedings being video streamed live via the Parliament's website, and a Hansard transcript is being made. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence. Witnesses also have a right to request to be heard in camera. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the ground upon which the objection is made, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer having regard to the ground which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. I remind committee members and witnesses who are appearing via video conference and not speaking to please mute your microphones. And for this inquiry, answers to questions on notice are due Tuesday, the 5th of November. I now welcome Professor the Honourable Kevin Bell, Professor Hal Pawson and Dr Chris Martin. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today? Professor Bell. I'll start with Professor Pawson, who I think is there in Canberra.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for inviting me. I'd like to also acknowledge the honourable people who are the traditional custodians of this land.
Sorry, Professor Pawson, we're just doing name, rank and serial number just at this point, so just introduce yourself for a Hansard.
And my name is Professor Hal Pawson from the University of New South Wales. I've been an academic housing researcher for 30 years, and I'm also an unpaid advisor to Senator David Pocock.
Thank you very much. And Professor Bell? And you're on mute, Professor Bell. Oh.
Thank you. I'm Kevin Bell. I'm an adjunct professor in international human rights law at Monash University. I'm a former Justice of the Supreme Court of Victoria, and have been working in housing and related fields all my adult life.
Welcome, and Dr Martin.
Hello there, I'm Dr Chris Martin. I'm a Scientia Senior Research Fellow in the City Futures Research Centre at University of New South Wales, and previously a worker in the community legal sector. I too have worked in housing for nearly 25 years.
Fantastic. Welcome to all of you. Do you have a brief opening statement, Professor Pawson? And can I just get a sense of how many opening statements there are? Is there just the one, or do others have them too?
I have one, yes.
Yes. So please. Okay. So please proceed. Okay, 3 opening statements, so I'll cut you off at 2 minutes. Professor Pawson, thank you.
Thank you. So housing and homelessness problems are important because they damage individuals, they damage individual welfare, and they also harm economic productivity. These are problems which can lead to outcomes which are complex and interconnected. They're hard to deal with. Addressing them in a country like Australia is particularly challenging because of the structure of government that, in some ways, the federal system makes this more difficult. Housing policy challenges and powers and responsibilities are fragmented across both the 2 levels of government and across departments within governments. And so for a policy area like this, we think there's a very strong case for policies and programmes to be designed to function in a coherent and integrated way. And so in advocating a national housing and homelessness plan, or strategy, if you want to call it that, we argue the value of a strategy is the beneficial role it can have in clarifying the purpose of action for everyone involved. So a meaningful strategy brings together information and expertise that informs and stimulates public discussion. In identifying problems and defining priorities, it can help to get everyone on the same page, which is a very big challenge in an area as complex as this. Australia's worsening housing problems are partly a failure of policy making. We've failed to approach housing in a coherent way, a coherent and joined up way. And even in under past Commonwealth governments that have been a bit more ambitious than many, like the Rudd-Gillard governments, for example, they saw the impacts of the many housing initiatives that were launched in that period. They saw those impacts dissipate pretty quickly. And that was partly because they lacked any unifying framework or rationale. And the housing policy challenges we face today are more stubborn and more intractable than they were then, so we need to take this seriously. And the conviction that Australia needs to embrace a more strategic approach to housing was a key factor that united 117 academic and industry experts who signed up to a letter earlier this year to the Housing Minister, urging her to legislate the National Housing and Homelessness Plan that the Albanese government has pledged to produce. If this country has a serious ambition to stop the rot in this area, it really has to address the situation or recognise the situation that comes about partly because of the incoherent way that we approach this. So in my last sentence, establishing a meaningful, ambitious and evidence-based national plan we would argue is a crucial part of the way forward here. It doesn't guarantee that Australia tackles its housing problems better in the future than it has in the past, but it gives us a better chance of doing so.
Thank you. Professor Bell. I'll just go to, Professor Bell.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee in relation to this historic proposed legislation. I come to you from Bunurong Boonwurrung country of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also to Indigenous people participating in the hearing, and specifically Senator Stewart, who's a member of this committee. I was one of the many people to whom Professor Pawson referred, who signed a petition calling for this legislation, which is proposed by Senator Pocock and Ms Tink, MP, whom I congratulate for this initiative. I want to thank the Senate for taking the proposed legislation seriously, and I want to thank it for referring the legislation for consideration to this committee through the inquiry process, including through this public hearing. As the committee may be aware, I have recently published a book on why Australia needs to adopt a human rights-based approach to housing, and I asked the committee to consider the argument in the book as a contribution to its deliberations in relation to this proposed legislation. There is not a single Australian who does not know from their own direct or indirect experience that the situation in relation to housing in this country is disastrous. The situation has been decades in the making, for which ultimate responsibility must rest on the shoulders of government, as must responsibility for bringing about necessary transformational reform. And it is only transformational reform that I submit will succeed, and the proposed legislation is that kind of reform. All parts of the system need to be included: home ownership, social housing, rental housing, and housing services for those experiencing homelessness. And I ask that the right to self-determination for Indigenous people be given particular emphasis in the committee's consideration as to how that will be brought about. The idea that housing is property and an opportunity for the accumulation of wealth and the making of profit is so pervasive in Australian society that it shuts out other more human-centred ways of looking at it. Housing as a home, housing as a place in which individuals and families can live in dignity, in peace and in security, somewhere where they can achieve their best and thrive. And most importantly of all, a fundamental human right. I ask the committee to open their minds to this other way of looking at housing and think through its implications in relation to the proposed legislation. The depth of support for the legislation is evidenced by the strong submissions that have been made to the committee and will be made today. Many of those submissions come from leading people and organisations who are masters of the detail in their fields. I support their submissions and I ask the committee to give them serious consideration, as I know it will.
I'll just need to ask you to start to wrap up now.
I'll close up. Thank you, Chair. My submission is that one thing is absolutely indispensable for the housing system in Australia to be transformed into one that works for people and for all people and for all ways. One based in law, that is in legislation, on recognition and implementation of the human right to adequate housing, which the proposed bill does. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Martin.
Thank you, Chair. I'll begin by acknowledging the Bedegal people whose country the University of New South Wales is located on. Respect to the Bedegal and their elders, past and present. I'm the lead author of a report commissioned by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute called Towards a National Housing and Homelessness Strategy. This was the basis not only for our submission to this inquiry, but also for the representations and briefings that we gave Senator David Pocock and Kylie Tink, leading to the development of this bill. But I'm also conscious that I'm drawing on all of the prior work that I mentioned in research and in the community legal sector. Advice calls from tenants, representing tenants in eviction proceedings and talking to advocates, housing workers, support workers on all of the problems and barriers they face, trying to get people into and keep people in affordable and decent housing. The Ahuri research was aimed at substantiating the rationale for a national approach to housing policy, and that my colleague Hal Pawson has spoken to that already. We investigated national approaches recently taken in other policy areas in our federal system in Australia, disability and closing the gap. We also investigated international examples of housing policy making with a particular focus on Canada as another similar federation which has implemented a national housing strategy. We distilled the lessons, what to do and what to do better for a national approach to housing and homelessness in the Australian Federation, and we determined that the key is a national plan with a statutory basis. In our view, the bill would establish several crucial legal foundations for successful national plan making in housing and homelessness. One, a basic obligation on the Minister to prepare and implement a plan to account to Parliament on its progress. Two, a set of objectives based on Australia's human rights obligations, guiding the development of the plan and the diverse policy making activities that would take place under it, providing a framework too for its reporting. Three, a 10-year timeframe for the plan, requiring the Minister and the Government to set out a vision beyond the current electoral cycle. Four, a collaborative approach to preparing the plan, requiring consideration of information and advice from certain expert sources and persons with lived experience of housing stress and homelessness. Also, new institutions to provide independent advice to government on housing and homelessness issues and on progress of the plan as an accountability measure. And six, designating a lead agency for preparing and implementing the plan, being Housing Australia, which would clarify responsibilities within government.
Thank you so much. We'll go now to questions, and I'll go to Senator Pocock.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for your time this morning. Professor Bell, you talked about housing being considered a fundamental human right. My understanding is that under international law, it is considered a human right, but that doesn't translate here in Australia. How can we change that? How can we better reflect international law and treaties that we've signed up to in our domestic laws?
We can do that in a number of ways, Senator. The bill that you propose is one way, and one important way through which that can be done. It would recognise the right to adequate housing as the foundation for a plan that would be whose purpose would be to implement it. That's one way. That's a sector-specific way. Because of the conditions facing Australia in relation to housing at the moment, I support that way as being indispensable. But it's not the only way, and another way, which I argue should run alongside this legislation, is to incorporate the right to housing in a Human Rights Act to be enacted at the federal level. That is what the Australian Human Rights Commission has proposed. That recommendation has been considered in detail by the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights, and it has recommended that the right to housing be included in a federal Human Rights Act. Other things need to be done at the state level because housing is within the jurisdiction of the states in terms of on-the-ground implementation, and for any national housing plan to be effective, the states need to be encouraged to exercise their constitutional responsibility in a way which is consistent with respect for human rights. But all of this can be done and is within the constitutional authority of the very Australian parliaments within our federation.
Mm-hmm. And in your mind, what are the benefits of positioning housing as a human right rather than an investment vehicle? What does that do for a society?
What it does is what the current system does not do. It makes the human person the very purpose of the system, and because housing is necessary for the development and achieving the maximum personal and family and social potential of the human person, the human right which protects those interests and which enables those interests to be expressed is really necessary. As soon as you put erect profit and investment and wealth accumulation as the purpose of the system rather than as the handmaiden of something else, that is the human person, then the system operates in a very skewed fashion. And I argue that we have lost a focus on the dignity of the individual, lost a focus on the on what housing means for people and society in human terms, moved away from those fundamental values in a direction which is unbalanced and produced problems which recognising and implementing the human right to housing would solve.
Thank you, Professor Bell, and I also commend your book to anyone on the committee or listening in. It's well worth a read. And just for the committee's sake, as Professor Pawson said, he has been volunteering in my office, working on housing policy, extraordinary knowledge and mind in this area, and I've been very grateful for his work. And I also want to acknowledge that Dr. Martin has also had input into the bill that is before the Senate and has used his expertise. Professor Pawson, given the Albanese government has already committed to a national housing and homelessness plan, the thing that they will say is, well, there's no need to legislate it because we have a plan. What's the benefit of actually legislating a plan at a federal level?
Thank you, Senator. Well, I think firstly, because I think we probably still need to make the case to have a plan. I say that because while the current government came to office with a pledge to do so, to develop a national housing and homelessness plan for the first time in Australia, which is quite something, that is still awaited. the output of that hasn't yet appeared. We know a lot of work's been done on it, so it certainly hasn't been just dumped. But we do have a new minister in that role quite recently, and we await a kind of reconfirmation of that commitment. Maybe we'll see the plan published tomorrow. Who knows? We haven't. There's no information on that, but there's a little bit of a possibility that perhaps that is no longer something that's intended. But beyond that, the plan itself, when it appears, assuming that it will, needs to be meaningful. It's no good if it's just called a strategy or a plan if it doesn't contain the fundamental qualities of such a plan, or such a document. So it has to be more than just a brochure that's a kind of list of the many initiatives that this government has rolled out, and there's absolutely no denying that, but they are not very coherent. And they don't have a clear rationale, and they don't have a clear future direction. So we need a plan that is meaningful, and therefore the legislation that Senator Pocock has put forward is creating a clearer framework for that enterprise, for that strategy, for that plan, and clarifying it in such a way that it can't be just a brochure or a listing. It has to have the fundamental qualities that a meaningful strategy must have. It's got to be properly based in analysis. It's got to be clearly. It's got to contain clear targets and a means to achieve those objectives. So I think those are some of the reasons why we need a plan or a strategy. I think that's a better word for it, actually. And it's advantageous to have that laid down in legislation.
You mentioned federation and states' responsibility for housing. Do you see any constitutional issues with this bill?
On the face of it, it does raise questions because, yes, the Australian Constitution doesn't specify housing explicitly as a power or a responsibility of the federal government, but the bill has been drafted very carefully to fully recognise and comply with constitutional requirements, not overstepping those limitations, recognising that there are only limited powers that the federal government can use on a topic like this, and also recognising that states and territories would be fundamentally important partners in developing the plan, and it could be possible to amend some of the detail of the clauses to make that even clearer. But the bill that's proposed respects those limitations and understands them. And because it is partly inspired by the Canadian legislation, which is coming from a country which is structured in an extremely similar way to Australia, we think that is that's why that is such a relevant source of inspiration for how we structure our approach.
Thank you very much. Dr. Martin, what, if anything, is special about housing that justifies the case for a national strategic approach?
Thanks, Senator. Well, housing and the homeless, they're complex policy issues because they cross over into other policy areas, taxation, finance, planning, tenancy law and consumer protection law. Just in giving those examples, I've also shown how housing and homelessness cross over different levels of government. So things that are clearly within the remit of the Commonwealth, even though there's no constitutional head of power that mentions housing, absolutely our tax system and our finance are very much within the remit of the Commonwealth and are powerful influences on our housing system. They constitute our housing system in a big way. So housing and homelessness are complex crossover policy areas, crossing over into other policy areas and other levels of government. And to deal with that complexity, we need a plan, we need a strategy to bring the diverse policymakers and other stakeholders together in a collaborative way that really works on some key objectives, which I think our human rights view on housing provides and helps people to get on the same page and on a common starting point for the collaborative missions or objectives, if you like, that all of our community and sector stakeholders and policymakers must address if we're to make progress on our housing and homelessness problems.
Thank you. And just finally, before I hand over the call, you mentioned in your opening statement the need to look beyond an electoral cycle, and certainly share that frustration. You even look at the government's Help to Buy bill, which they tell us is such a great idea, and I agree it has merits, but that's only a 4-year program. So I'm interested if you could expand on that when it comes to housing, these sort of short-term fixes that are sold to the electorate, but they don't seem to have helped given where we are and where we're heading.
Yeah, and I think too, having a national housing plan would also help keep a sense of perspective on some of those particular policy set pieces, if I can call them that. So the Help to Buy legislation, for example, would, in the scheme of things, it would assist a certain number of people, but it's not huge. So it's an innovation, and it's sort of eye-catching at least for housing policy people like myself and everyone in this hearing, I'm sure. But its impacts are probably pretty limited. So the fact that it has been the subject of controversy and is held up in a debate about what is the wider plan and how to deal with the housing, how to deal with our housing problems in a more systemic way. If we had that wider plan, I think the government might be in a position to better represent to its other parliamentarians and to the general public just where these different policy set pieces fit in the wider scheme of things, and might have a better way ahead of actually prosecuting those sorts of reforms. As for looking beyond the election cycle, as Professor Bell said, that the sorts of problems that we have in our housing system have been mounting for decades, and there are so long-term we need some long-term projects like the building up again of our social housing sector. The scale of the unmet housing need amongst low-income renters and people who are homeless and households that are overcrowded. It's currently 650,000 households. It's going to grow to just under 1 million households by 2041. So it's projected. Meeting that scale of need means scaling up, in particular, our social housing sector in a big way, and that will take time. So having a plan and having a plan that goes for the long term is something we need to meet the scale of our problems.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for coming and giving your evidence today and your work on the background to this hearing as well. It's an important debate, and we thank you for your contributions, and you go with our thanks today. Thank you.
Thank you for hearing us.
I now welcome representatives of the Aboriginal Housing and Homelessness Forum, COTA Australia, and the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, as we get people online and in the room, I will just take a brief suspension while we check on our next witnesses. So the committee resumes, and we do have our next witnesses ready to go. So thank you. So for the Hansard record, would you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today, starting with Aboriginal Housing and Homelessness Forum?
Good morning. I'm Darren Smith, the chair of the Aboriginal Housing and Homelessness Forum down in Victoria.
Welcome, Mr. Smith. And COTA.
Good morning. Yes, David Wright-Howie, Senior Policy Officer at the Council on the Ageing Australia.
Welcome. And Australian Youth Affairs Coalition.
Hi, it's Jo Rastami. I'm the CEO of the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition.
Welcome to you all. Mr. Smith, did you have a brief opening statement that you wanted to give? And if so, please go ahead.
Thank you. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country that I'm on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, pay my respect to the elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that you're all on and acknowledge that their country was never ceded. I'd just like to introduce you to the Aboriginal Housing and Homelessness Forum. The AF comprises 38 Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, traditional owner groups and Aboriginal trusts who are either delivering housing and homelessness services in Victoria or who have an interest in housing and homelessness services and outcomes. The AF operate collectively along with the Victorian Government to implement Manana, Warranty and Marta Court, the Victorian Aboriginal Housing and Homelessness Framework. Manana, Warranty and Marta Court is a framework to achieve quality housing outcomes for Aboriginal people within a generation. Manana, Warranty and Marta Court is the only Aboriginal specific housing and homelessness plan that has been endorsed by government, and this provides us with a basis for a national plan. The AF members recognise the right to adequate housing as a fundamental human right and essential for upholding human dignity and well-being, and believes a rights-based framework should be the starting point for all legislation regarding housing and homelessness. The National Housing and Homelessness Plan has the potential to provide better housing and homelessness outcomes for First Nations peoples, provided that it does increase the accountability of government in the delivery and reaffirms that housing is a right enshrined in international law. The AF members are in broad support of the proposed bill, and today I would like to make three key points in relation to the AF's view of the proposed bill and the opportunity it presents for the future. Firstly, the National Plan for Housing and Homelessness should be required to address what actions have been taken to address the housing and homelessness challenge facing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. As stated in the submission, the national housing crisis is much better described as a state of emergency for Aboriginal people. The number of Aboriginal Victorians at risk of homelessness has increased by 29% over the past 4 years. The level of homelessness and unmet social housing demand is at least 10 times greater for Aboriginal people compared to the general population across Australia. The failure of existing policy and absence of a strategy or national housing plan has led to the current housing and homelessness challenges we face, and it is essential there is greater accountability to Aboriginal communities from government as a plan and a way forward is mapped out. The AF support the proposal that the Minister collaboratively prepares a plan and reports back to community, and we would suggest building in a mechanism for the AF and other Aboriginal peak housing bodies to provide feedback on the plan periodically as well. In our submission, we also spoke to the need to consult the peak body of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Housing Association as a priority and sustain this relationship as the plan progresses. Secondly, the National Plan for Housing and Homelessness should adopt a principle that enables Aboriginal self-determination. Mananawarnti and Marta Court is implemented by AF members and has Aboriginal self-determination at the core. Our members represent and bring to the reform knowledge and expertise from the communities they work with and represent to address, respond and try and find solutions for housing and homelessness needs. Our national plan should preference approaches which put ownership, control and funding for housing and homelessness into the hands of the Aboriginal community through community-controlled organisations. It is fundamentally important Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have direct input into all housing programs that will affect communities. The AF also would expect the plan will ensure mainstream providers will address and meet the unique needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the provision of housing and homelessness services to Aboriginal communities. We suggest that Mananawarnti and Marta Court has strategic goals which could be used in a national housing and homelessness plan. The strategic goals of Mananawarnti and Marta Court are secure housing improves life outcomes, build supply to meet the needs of a growing Aboriginal population, open doors to home ownership and private rental, an Aboriginal focused homelessness system and a capable system that delivers Aboriginal housing needs. I think I'll leave it there and thank you for the opportunity to be heard.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Mr. Wright, Howie.
Good morning. Yes, thanks for the opportunity. I too am on Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation and pay respect to elders past, present. Coda Australia supports the bill. The bill provides a strong foundation for a nationally coordinated, publicly accountable 10-year plan with a human rights approach. Australia's population is ageing and an increasing number of Australians are experiencing a housing crisis and homelessness, including many older people. In our experience, older people can be left out of government housing and homelessness policy and planning discussions and decisions. So we're calling on a plan that identifies and recognises older people aged 50 years and over as a priority group for transitional housing and homeless support services, and that enables the implementation of community and public housing initiatives for older people, particularly single older women. We note that under the Housing Australia Future Fund, funding was allocated for crisis and transitional housing options for both women and children impacted by family and domestic violence, but also older women at risk of homelessness. It is our understanding that these two groups were bundled together in the one funding target. It is a much needed initiative, but it's unclear how much funding or housing units have been allocated to single older women requiring housing or at risk of homelessness. We would argue for a distinct funding and housing target for older women to ensure they receive some of this funding and a recognition of older people as a priority group. The plan also enables increases in the maximum threshold of Commonwealth rent assistance, and we think there should also be a review of Commonwealth rent assistance to examine its effectiveness, appropriateness, targeting accuracy and its efficiency. We welcome the formation of a consumer council under the bill, as this provides an important consumer and lived experience input into policy making. We urge the Senate committee to ensure that older people experiencing housing insecurity and homelessness are included as part of the Consumer Council. We also support the Housing and Homelessness Advocate proposed in the bill, as this will ensure that systemic housing issues are addressed through its independent investigation powers and capacity to monitor the progress of a national plan. We also think it's important in the plan, as outlined in the bill, that it's long-term and beyond the 3-year election cycles, and that the Commonwealth Housing Minister is required to periodically report to Parliament on the progress of the plan, providing an additional level of parliamentary oversight and interest. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Rostami.
Thank you. Firstly, I'll acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continued connection to land, waters and culture, and pay respect to elders past and present. Thank you to the committee for the invitation to attend this inquiry. I'm representing AYAC. We're the national peak body for young people, representing more than 4.5 million young people across the country, an estimated 40,000 of which who are likely to be homeless each night, although this number is considered an underestimate. Our members include youth-led organisations, youth sector organisations and young people themselves. Our work focuses on systemic advocacy, research, sector support and youth engagement. AYAC commends the government's intention to formulate a rights-based approach to housing and homelessness. We appreciate the bill's explicit reference to developing and maintaining the National Housing and Homelessness Plan. We hope this is a protection against changing political priorities that so often accompany a change in government. However, AYAC would like to emphasise the need for specific amendments to the bill to ensure the unique needs of young people are addressed. Currently, young people are referenced in relation to the National Housing Consumer Council. However, it doesn't guarantee their membership. And given the council will play a key role in advising on the effectiveness of the plan, as well as on current issues relating to housing and homelessness, we believe that young people with diverse lived experience should have guaranteed positions. The unique drivers of youth homelessness must also receive sufficient focus in the bill's prevention efforts. These include a lack of appropriate support when exiting youth justice and out-of-home care settings, neglect, abuse and family dysfunction and breakdown, family rejection due to homophobia and transphobia, age discrimination in the private rental market, barriers to affordable housing which are exacerbated by unstable, casualised employment alongside study commitments, and inadequate income support payment. Prevention efforts must also acknowledge that young people experience different pathways to homelessness, as well as different types of homelessness from those of adults. Couch surfing and overcrowding being predominant experiences, for example. And of course, young people who enter the homelessness cycle are more likely to still be there as an adult. So that early intervention is crucial. Key recommendations AYAC would like to make include incorporating the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, increasing focus on homelessness prevention through raising the rate of youth allowance and job seeker to above the poverty line, guaranteed youth seats in the National Housing Consumer Council to ensure meaningful youth representation, and developing a standalone youth housing and homelessness plan which is co-designed with young people with lived experience across the spectrum of housing and homelessness. This last one is particularly important given the absence of any other plan in terms of a whole-of-government youth policy or strategy or framework to address the needs of young people. Meaningful collaboration with young people throughout all stages of the plan's development is essential to ensure the challenges and needs of young Australians are addressed and to ultimately improve the relevance and success of the plan and keep the community out of the homelessness system into the future. AYAC welcomes the opportunity to support the committee's work and can provide further information or respond to queries on the issues discussed here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'll go to you, Senator Pocock.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for your time this morning. Mr. Smith, if I can start with a question to you. How could a national plan on housing and homelessness led by the Commonwealth Government help improve the housing prospects of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
Firstly, by recognising the different needs of Aboriginal people and that there is a significant level of disadvantage in Aboriginal communities. So by recognising them, then also ensuring that there is a separate objective around improving housing outcomes for Aboriginal people. One of the things that we do need is we need coordination with state and territory governments from the Commonwealth every jurisdiction is very different. Every jurisdiction is very different in terms of the political landscape for Aboriginal communities and for their organisations, and we don't have a coherent approach nationally. So we need to have some clear targets around what we want to achieve. As I said before, there's a crisis in Aboriginal communities, and it's not going to get addressed without national attention and recognition. And that means that we need to have, as I said, a clear set of objectives around how we're going to address it, and then we need that to correlate into coordinated action with state and territory governments as well.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Ms. Rostami, you talked about the need for more consultation with young people and even the need for a youth-specific plan. How important do you think it is to have agreed national objectives and a specific national plan to deal with this?
I think it's very important, and certainly not in a position to undermine the interests of the other groups present. There's no denying that all are very, very important and need specific attention. I think in regards to young people, though, particularly, there isn't a national strategy or approach to dealing with youth issues more broadly, so that the lack of coordination mentioned previously, oversight, the fact that youth issues fall into so many different portfolios ends up being problematic because things are siloed and not approached in that whole of government way. In the absence of that, I would think that a youth-specific plan or approach is crucial. As we know, young people who do experience homelessness early on are more likely to continue through and be adults, and it's much harder to address the needs and concerns then. So I think it's quite important in terms of early intervention and prevention, but also the fact that there's a lack of oversight and leadership and approach to these issues which impact young people. In terms of engaging their voice, young people are the experts in their lived experience of this and how we address youth homelessness and its changing nature and the ways that people present. I think we can only do any policy response well when we consult with young people, listen to young people and actually implement what they request. I think we're quite good at talking to them, but less good at actually acting on it and incorporating it and feeding that back, which again is crucial in actually the success of any plan, whether it's youth-specific or otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Mr. Wright Howie, you mentioned in your opening statement the fact that older women are one of the fastest growing cohorts of homeless people in Australia. I hear a bit of rhetoric around trying to solve this, but how important do you think it is that we actually have a plan to meet their housing needs?
Oh, I think it's critical. There's a range of initiatives around the country that are there to support older homeless people, but it's not very coordinated at all. It's very piecemeal. It's not formalised at all. It's stronger in some places and some states and in some cities. There's not a range of options, which can lead to some older people prematurely and inappropriately ending up in residential aged care facilities, and if there was more options available, we could prevent this. We know that older people, all people really, want to age in place in the community in which they live, and a lot of the policy actually leads to people moving away from being able to do that. We certainly experience older people coming to our care finders increasingly with housing issues, but also other issues with aged care, health, and their issues need to be addressed across a range of portfolios and jurisdictions. And that would be similar to my colleagues here on the panel, what they experience. I mean, I want to say that older people have benefited greatly from the housing system, but also an increasing number of older people are turning up in housing and homelessness services, which may buck the general stereotype trend in the community.
Yeah, I think it's an important point. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'll hand over the call.
Thanks very much, Senator Pocock. Thanks everyone for being with us today. Mr. Smith, in your submission and in your opening statement, you talked about the need for a specific Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing focus and investment. And that's been identified as one of the priority areas for the plan that's being developed. If this particular bill, went forward, or if it didn't go forward, what's the main approach or the number one thing that you would like to see happen to improve access to housing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, be that renting or buying? What's your number one priority?
I think probably the way to answer that is I'll refer to Manana Warntia Mata Court. There's two themes that are in Manana Warntia Mata Court. The first is requiring a safety net of effective homelessness services and providing good access to social housing. Without that, you're not going to be able to achieve all the other outcomes immediately. So we need housing supply that's in the hands of Aboriginal organisations, so through social and affordable housing. And then secondly, the other theme that goes through Manana Warntia Mata Court is about providing housing independence. And really the aspiration of a number of the Aboriginal community members that we went and talked with when we were developing Manana Warntia Mata Court was for home ownership. And we need to actually build programs that work for Aboriginal people. So at the moment, with the Housing Australia Future Fund facility, we are not seeing the number of Aboriginal housing dwellings being committed through that program. And the reality is that most Aboriginal community-controlled organisations can't participate. And this is why we need the Commonwealth to actually make sure that there's a priority and a target on Aboriginal housing and homelessness outcomes, because the programs, when they get delivered, they need to get delivered into Aboriginal communities, they are too complex. You need to build the capacity of the providers as part of what you need to do, and as part of it you need to ensure that it's consistent with Aboriginal self-determination. So we do need the Commonwealth's lead in order to actually achieve the outcomes.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. And that concludes the questions that the committee has for you all today. So thank you very much for your evidence, your submissions and answering our questions, and you go with our thanks today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We will call our next witnesses and see if we have them online a few minutes early. And I will welcome representatives from the Property Council of Australia, the Real Estate Institute of Australia and the Community Housing Industry Association. I think we have some of our witnesses ready to go a little bit early, so we'll welcome everyone. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided. Perhaps starting with those of you in Canberra, if we could welcome you, and if you could state your full name and the capacity in which you're appearing today.
Wendy Hayhurst, I'm CEO of the Community Housing Industry Association.
Thank you.
Maria Edwards, I'm the Interim CEO of the Real Estate Institute of Australia.
Thank you. And while we are getting Mr Zorbas online from the Property Council, I might ask you to start with any opening statements that you have. So please go ahead. Thank you.
I'll kick off, Chair. Chair welcomes the opportunity to provide evidence to the Senate Economics Legislation Committee. Chair endorses the bill's intent to legislate the requirement to produce a national plan. Chair, together with Homelessness Australia and National Shelter, with whom we made a joint submission to this inquiry, have strongly supported the current government's election commitment to produce a national housing and homelessness plan. In recent decades, the approach to housing strategy and policy at the federal level has been through periodic initiatives responding to particular circumstances and opportunities. However, the extent and complexity of housing and homelessness problems, and the fact that these both cross over different levels of government and also involve non-housing, and that's in inverted commas, I should add, areas of government, mean there is a need for concerted, strategic and nationally led approach. Given the history, we believe legislating the requirement to produce a plan is essential. Transforming the housing market is a long-term proposition, and the institutions that support it need to be designed to survive beyond the current electoral cycle. We recognise governments may choose to modify actions in a plan, but an ongoing national leadership on ensuring adequate housing for all is essential. Our support for the legislation has been reinforced by concerns about the current plan's progress, the lack of an expert advisory committee driving the plan, the disappointing issues paper released in July 2023, the omissions in the January 2024 consultation summary, and the finalisation of the new National Agreement on Social Housing and Homelessness in advance of the plan's release, and the absence and subsequent dialogue or report on the plan's progress together contribute to this concern. While we're supporting the bill, we have in our submission suggested some amendments, and of course I'm prepared to take questions on those. Perhaps in particular, it's making explicit the role of states and territory governments in housing, in the housing plan too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Hayhurst. Thank you for your opening statement. And Ms Edward, did you have an opening statement you wanted to give?
Sure. I speak today on behalf of the Real Estate Institute of Australia, or REA, the voice for over 46,000 real estate businesses across the nation. Housing is the backbone of Australia's economy, with the residential real estate valued at over $10.8 trillion. Yet, we face a stark housing crisis that is impacting everyday Australians and our broader economy. As the real estate industry, we feel this strain deeply, with our members at the front line dealing with the reality. For every person who finds a property to rent, there are often dozens of people who have applied and missed out. Our property managers would love to help everyone, but with the current supply crisis, it's just impossible. Our members are also having to deliver rent increases to tenants when landlords are faced with higher interest rates and cost of living pressures, and worse still, eviction notices when either the landlord or tenant can no longer afford the property. The latest REA Housing Affordability Report shows housing affordability continues to deteriorate across all states and territories. Households are now spending over 40% of their income on mortgage payments, a sharp increase from previous years. For renters, the situation is equally dire. Rental vacancy rates have reached an all-time low, averaging 1.6% nationally and falling to as low as 0.5% in some regions. At REA, we believe that this bill presents an opportunity to coordinate efforts to tackle homelessness and housing in a collaborative way. Currently, the fragmentation of responsibilities across multiple government portfolios is contributing to inefficiencies and delayed housing outcomes. We believe that centralising efforts under one well-resourced entity would ensure a coordinated, streamlined approach to addressing both the immediate housing crisis and longer-term needs. Whilst the implementation of the bill includes extensive consumer consultation, REA would like to ensure there's no reduction in consultation with housing and construction peak bodies such as ours, who have a vital role to play in combating homelessness. Our industry acknowledges homelessness is not just an economic issue, it's about people's lives. Housing should not be a source of stress or instability, but a foundation for building communities, supporting families and enabling economic participation. REA stands ready to collaborate with government and industry partners to tackle these critical issues. With the right policy settings, we can create a future where all Australians have access to affordable, safe and secure housing.
Thank you very much, Ms Edward, and we also welcome to the hearing Mr Mike Zorbas, the Chief Executive of the Property Council of Australia. We got going a little bit early, Mr Zorbas, so thanks for joining us. Do you have a brief opening statement that you'd like to give?
Yes, I do, Chair, and thank you very much. Lovely to see your smiling face again, and thank you to my co-panellists. This is obviously an area which has long been neglected by your federal parliamentary forebears, and I note that all committee members who I've come to know a little bit better this year have been very diligent in paying attention to housing. It's very important to us, to you and to the nation. So thank you for that. Property Council's 2,500 organisation strong membership includes Australia's leading residential build-to-buy developers, the largest global investors in build-to-rent housing, purpose-built student accommodation and retirement living. We're an evidence-led organisation that refers to data to support sensible policy solutions. And I would say this, and it's an important thing, I expect the Property Council will continue without fear or favour to champion the interests of our members in working with all parliamentarians to solve the undeniable crisis which my colleagues just referred to. We've championed national housing targets supported by a mainly carrot and some stick approach to housing since I first started the Property Council in the year 2000. Admittedly, 22 years is one heck of a wait, but as a consequence, it won't surprise anyone on this call that we remain resolute champions of national target setting and the measurement of those targets. That accountability is critical. So let's see which of the 6 states and 2 territories make their housing supply targets. Let's see who might fail and by how much. Let's talk about how to bridge the gap between the different states where there are some that make it and some that don't. Targets are useful even if you don't make them. I'll save the detail of that target commentary for Q&A, but it's something that we've specialised in over the years. I do just want to make one other remark, and that is it's our consistent belief that housing supply should create diversity and choice of form, that is, choice for people to meet their housing needs at different points of their life, hence our support for purpose-built student accommodation when you're a bit younger, and retirement villages and BTR as you age through the life cycle. We're very interested in supply. That is the main game in our view, but there are also other elements on the spectrum which routinely come up, and we have strong views on each of these, including access to finance, demand-side stimulus, where absolutely needed, changes to negative gearing. No one on this panel, I hope, is surprised by our positions on that because there's no evidence they increase supply. And, of course, at the other end of the spectrum, rent capping or gold-plated government developers, and we're less in favour of those. In fact, that's quite a chilly end of the spectrum as far as housing supply goes. But, Chair, I'll leave it at that. And back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Pocock.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for your time this morning. Ms. Hayhurst, thinking back over recent decades, how would you rate the level of engagement with housing policy challenges by the Commonwealth Government and the coherence of Commonwealth housing initiatives over time?
I would say really in recent decades it's been episodic. So there are individual policies that I could point to, whether it's the coalition setting up of the National Housing Investment Finance Corporation or the current government's initiatives on the Housing Australia Future Fund. So there have been some very good initiatives. What I don't think we have had is a coherent narrative, a coherent understanding based on analysis of all the data, which takes into account that different parts of the sector, the housing and construction and property sector, have different opinions, and trying to reconcile what the differences are there and getting a way through those differences. I think it's that lack of a joined-up plan that has really prevented us doing that. We've all argued for our own bit of the system. What we haven't done is come together and agree, gosh, we do have this crisis across the spectrum. How are we going to solve it? So that's one of the reasons we support a plan, but it has to be a plan that isn't just a series of initiatives. It has to make sense. That's why I think legislating it gives it a seriousness. There is an obligation to produce something that is going to have to deliver and be reported on.
Thank you. In your submission, you have you make some suggestions for amendments to the bill. I was wondering if you could explain some of the proposed changes and what they would do, or how, in your mind, they would improve the bill.
Well, a national plan, by its very name, has to involve states and territories. So even though the legislative obligation lies on the Commonwealth, there has to be, I think, in the bill, a recognition that states and territories are going to play a very important role in producing the plan, but also delivering on its actions. So I think there are various points, and I won't name the clauses, where I think it's possible to strengthen the bill there. The other thing, and it comes back to this point about coherence and the connectivity of the housing system, we tend to think of certain things as being housing and then other things that government does having no impact. We don't take sufficient of attention, whether it's our plans for achieving net zero, whether it's migration. All of these things, government policy settings, will impact on the supply and demand for housing. So I think the bill can be strengthened to show how it connects to other plans and strategies that the government is going to do. And then finally, we really do welcome having a national advocate and housing advisory committee that sits alongside the council that represents consumers. I think the bill could be more explicit about how that is recruited to. There are times when I think it's the usual suspects that get onto these things, and broadening the representation on those groups would be great.
Thank you. I think that's a good addition. And I note this. Sophie Scomps has a bill in the lower house, the Ending Jobs for Mates bill, which I think should just be across the board inserted into legislation. Ms Edwards, in your submission you call for a unified department to take responsibility for Commonwealth housing policy and delivery, and I share this frustration when you're dealing with issues that are spread across multiple departments. You just get a lot of finger pointing and handballing, and no one's really sure who's doing what. When it comes to housing, you're looking at Treasury, DSS, Housing Australia, and even industry department when it comes to the building code. Can you talk a bit more about the value in consolidating that in one place and actually having a one-stop shop that's looking after housing?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a lot of confusion in industry about who to approach when there is an issue, and who, equally, we're finding more and more with government departments, you're just getting a generic email as opposed to a person to speak to, or, a generic phone number, and who do we actually talk to about these issues? And I think sometimes it serves different departments well to demonise certain parts of the industry, like our industry, and that's very frustrating for us. So, having to re-explain that we actually are not the enemy here, we actually want to help, and having a central point where we can put our point forward across to everybody would be really useful. So I think having that central, it's really important. There's so many different factors going into solving this problem. One point would be wonderful.
And what's your view on having a legislated national plan that sort of tries to pull together these, at times, sort of disparate things that are happening?
Fully support it. Yeah.
And is there anything, I guess, in particular that you would like to see in that plan that currently
I think
isn't?
For the accountability for the states to actually adhere to the plan, because big problems in housing is the affordability of land, the release of land, those sorts of things, which it's really important for the state and territory governments to release these things and to make it feasible for people to build and affordable to build houses. So I think, the mechanisms to make sure that the states are falling into line regardless of who's in power, who's the minister at the time, would be great. Because I feel like, the accountability is what really, of the actual plan, is what really appeals to me, and I think that making the states accountable to is really important.
Thank you. Mr Zorbas, you mentioned in your opening statement, and certainly all the experts are saying, supply-side measures are the key to the solution. What do you think are the biggest supply levers the Commonwealth can pull?
Well, let me start, Senator, if I may, by partly answering to your first question to Wendy. I mean, housing targets, actually being able to measure what we're doing, are still our main hope of leaving that federal and state and local government blame shifting of the last couple of decades behind. And we've seen, I think, through the work that you've done and other members of the committee have done over the last 12 months or so, that there has been some progress in the decade immediately behind us on both sides, both major parties, but that has been incremental, and it's been off a slow base. We all remember, I think, the Abbott government signalling very clearly that it thought that housing and state planning matters were matters solely for the states, and from that desert, only gradually did we get a cities policy out of the Turnbull government. And then by the time we had Morrison and Sukkar as Treasurer and Housing Minister and Assistant Treasurer, there was that move to the NIFIC model, which was really quite a substantial reclaiming, I think, by the coalition of their role in the housing debate. And while there's quite a bit of difference between Labor and the Coalition on these matters, it is important to recognise that both sides have been on a journey, and even when we got into the middle of the pandemic, the very welcome first homeowners boost that the Rudd government had brought in during the GFC was quite well evolved, I think, into HomeBuilder. And HomeBuilder gets a lot of rubbish in hindsight, but it was a massively important confidence booster for the industry. Might have needed some further tweaking in terms of the design of it. And if we ever suffered through something similar again, you would imagine that would happen again. But there have been useful evolutions on both sides. We know now that both major parties are in the last mile infrastructure game. And that has been very, very good to see, because that really does unlock housing at a much more rapid rate. There are so many barriers that essentially fall on first home buyers on the peri-urban fringe by way of taxation and by way of lack of infrastructure that we do need to think about more holistically. But I did also want to say this critical thing. In answer to your question, what are the key barriers to supply? Without question, planning improvements and the resourcing of local governments and state governments to do the right thing is a critical element in all of this. And it's much more likely we're going to make headway on those planning improvements and on housing deficits in general with a national and honest way of reporting on the performance or the underperformance of states and territories, as I've said, but also those local governments, because what happens and what has started to happen because of these targets, in addition to a wave of planning reform that simply would not have happened at any point in a coordinated manner over the next 20 years, and certainly didn't happen in the preceding 20 years, a coordinated wave of attention to planning detail, that can only occur as a result of that federal coordination. And what it starts to do is then starts to give local governments some incentive, some measurable targets against which their own performance might be measured, and indeed the basis for which they might make claims on state revenue for assistance with planning. I think if Alga were here this morning, they would say, well, look, there are 200 out of the 530 odd councils that don't even have a planner to call their own. So, there are quite substantial deficits, I think, from a federal point of view in the way that we've looked at housing over a very long time. And you just don't fix the shock absorbers in the system, like having enough planners, with a couple of years' work. You've really got to spend 5 to 7 years targeting this very carefully. So creating that measurable pro-investment environment in that at-market housing segment, which is still 97% of the Australian housing market. And you've heard me and of course Wendy speak at length about social housing and our support for the HAF. So I won't do that today, but I do want to focus on that 97%, which is really to buy or to rent. The fastest way of doing this is to make sure that we've got all the planning aspects aligned. There are financing questions, there are questions around interest rates and so forth. The market cycles will be what they are, but we need to create systems and processes that are ready, that can anticipate those down cycles. And I'll say just parenthetically, build to rent is a classic example. Patient institutional capital for the first 15 or 20 years, you would anticipate almost all of it coming from overseas before super funds would get involved. That can build at any point in the cycle. And, now would be the perfect time when you see that, for example, next year, we'll only build half the number of apartments in this country that we did in the year 2017. Now, given the size of our population growth, that is a remarkable undersupply there, and government should be thinking carefully about how to make sure that we're encouraging more, particularly high density around transport and transport-oriented developments, opportunity around employment hubs and so forth.
Thank you. You mentioned population growth there. I'm interested in how important you think it is to align housing supply targets with population growth and immigration. And do you think the current level of coordination is sufficient? What's happening in that space in your eyes?
I think it's a huge challenge. I'm not going to lay all these problems at the government of the day and say that it's been done flawlessly in the past. I haven't seen it done flawlessly in the past. But when we talk about immigration, we've got to keep a couple of things in mind. Firstly, that immigration is absolutely essential to the Australian story, and it has been since the Second World War, to our growth, to our prosperity. Migrants are net value adders to our community. They also plug a lot of the skills gaps in a 4% unemployment market that we can't filled by ourselves, and whether they are unskilled or skilled, I think on the basis, that we have a desire to have a growing economy and to have an ageing population well supported in old age, there are plenty of strong reasons to support a robust immigration program. Where the problem arises and where people's negative experience of immigration comes about is because our system has been undergeared for about 30 years in terms of dealing with that and producing enough supply. And here's the killer factoid. It's my favourite fact of the last 25 years in all of this. Dr. Tony Richards did an analysis which sits alongside, I must say, and this is quite important, the additional household formation of about 400,000 homes between the 2016 and the 2021 census. Bear with me, I'm doing a Trumpian weave here. And that is to say, his analysis shows that if we've been as productive in producing houses in the 20 years to 2021 as we had been in the 20 years to 2001, we would have produced as a nation 1.3 million extra homes. And if we produce 1.3 million extra homes, that more than soaks up the extra household formation of the last 40 years and well and truly would have put us on track for serious downward pressure on the cost of buying a home and the cost of renting a home. Now, we haven't done that. There has been a breakdown in the systems. There has been a lack of accountability. And I can't tell you the number of conversations I've had around the country with premiers, with state treasurers, state planning ministers over the last 25 years consistently saying, what do you think your target is? They don't have an answer, or they fudge it, or they don't want to be accountable for it. And this is the first time at a national level where we have not only an agreeable target, but we have an independent agency, run by somebody very smart in Sue Lloyd-Hurwitz who knows what she's doing, who said to the government, you've got a 1.2 million target and about 250,000 homes short. Here are the issues that you need to tackle. That is absolutely necessary for solving this problem. So I think, we cannot actually envisage a world where we're going to make any real progress without having proper targets.
I agree. I don't see how you achieve things without having a target. But once you set a target, what do you see the value in actually having a legislated plan that sends you in that direction?
Well, look, I'd like to think that everyone in the Parliament is now much more switched on to housing than they were when I first started working at the Property Council many moons ago. But I also know that these things come in waves. And I also remember very clearly, Prime Minister Rudd's barbecue stopper emergency meeting in Canberra about housing all those moons ago in 2007. And actually, absent targets and absent plans and absent some lock-in mechanism, nothing much happened on that front on his watch. And again, it is very much subject, without something more permanent, to the whims of the leaders of the day. And this is an obscure area. We all like to, understand what the residential housing market is doing. And I think a lot of people do, talk about that with their family and friends. But I think a lot of people don't understand the complexity of the drivers, or indeed the complexity of the challenges in finding investors, in keeping the banks happy, in the years that it takes to get planning approvals, with multiple layers of federal, state and local interventions and caveats and conditions that need to be met, with those huge number of gateways that are required to produce any new plot of land, particularly if you're doing large-scale master plan communities. These are very, very complicated, very expensive processes, and ultimately a great deal of thinking needs to be done on that front by state governments in particular around how to make those processes as easy as possible while still delivering the high-quality housing that we would all hope for in those areas. So I think, from my point of view, this is a very, very important thing that we make sure is a perpetual part of parliamentary consideration, not just something that relies on the goodwill of the four of you in this hearing today.
Thank you, Mrs. Orbis. Ms. Harris, picking up that sort of thread about having this target of 1.2 million homes, are you comfortable where community housing providers sit within that? Is there clarity about targets for social and affordable, where they're needed? What's the level of sort of detail that is contained in that?
I mean, I think it's good that there is a national target of 1.2 million. And Mike has just mentioned that we're 3%. We're probably nearer 4% in terms of the amount of social and affordable housing there. We need a target for social and affordable housing that is calibrated to the need out there. We're not very good at doing assessments of what's needed. We can get the supply target, but we don't go beyond that to look at the different types of housing, the different price points, the different locations. We heard Darren speaking about Aboriginal community-controlled organisations and the way that they have really lost out a bit in the current half. What we do need is to break that target of 1.2 million down into what we need in terms of different types of tenure. We've done a lot of work as a sector. We think it's 10% that should be social and affordable housing. This plan and legislating that plan, it will require that long-term approach, because we see at the moment programmes for social and affordable housing are usually a number rather than recognising it's a year-on-year activity. As the population grows, so does the need for social and affordable housing, unless we're never going to get to people, a vast number of people, 80, 90% of people in home ownership. We're going to always need a good amount of below-market housing.
Thank you. Ms Edwards, do you want to add anything to Mrs Orbis's points around, planning targets?
I worked in affordable housing as well, and I feel like that there's definitely opportunity for private investment to play a role in affordable housing as well with the right incentives. Having worked in it before, I know that there's an appetite for it, but it's a matter of making sure that what affordable housing and social housing is really defined for the private investor market, and also, as I said, sufficient incentives for them to participate. But the industry is open to it, definitely.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Pocock. That concludes the questions that the committee has for you all today. Thank you for your evidence. You go with our thanks.
Thank you.
The committee will now suspend for a break and will return at 10:45 a.m. And I now welcome Ms Amy Crawford and Mayor Matt Burnett of the Australian Local Government Association. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appeared today? And we'll start with you, Ms Crawford, there in Canberra.
Amy Crawford. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Local Government Association.
Thank you. And Mayor Burnett.
Yeah, thank you. Matt Burnett. I'm the Mayor of Gladstone region in Central Queensland, but also President of the Australian Local Government Association and President of the Local Government Association of Queensland, speaking today as the Elder President.
Thank you. Welcome to you both. Do you have a brief opening statement that you'd like to give?
Yeah, that's okay. I'd like to start, obviously, firstly, apologies for not being there. I had surgery yesterday, as you can see from my face, so I can't be in the room, but our CEO will be able to provide some more details, obviously, in the room. I just want to obviously start by saying housing is, as we all are aware, one of the biggest challenges facing our country. ELGA just recently held a housing summit because that's how important this issue is to our local communities. However, local councils, while they can zone for and approve housing supply, we're not responsible for the construction of the homes that councils approve. So this results in a situation where regions throughout Australia can have an excess of housing approved and at the same time an undersupply of actual housing. And I'll go into that a little bit more detail shortly. The shortage of actual housing affects the social and economic fabric of communities in many ways, from the inability to attract key workers, displacement and stress on low-income households, to the increase of people experiencing homelessness. Many councils are going above and beyond to address this crisis, but we're not resourced to play a more meaningful role. And an example of that I can give you is from here in Gladstone. We've recently, our council has approved on a block of land that we own, a freehold title we own, a 99-year lease with Community Housing Limited Queensland to build affordable accommodation housing for seniors, but also targeting to essential workers and those in the retail and healthcare space. And that's what we've done with our block of land to try and attract more housing into our community for those that need it most. And we've done that previously with other companies and organisations called the Gladstone Central Committee on the Ageing. Not our core business, but councils know that they need to be involved. One of the biggest issues is the lack of funding for roads, water, sewerage and power connections that are necessary for building new developments. Different jurisdictions across the country are responsible for different things, but in Queensland, for example, trunk infrastructure, particularly around southeast Queensland, funding for that would really support more housing developments. And I guess that's the case right across the state. And in other jurisdictions across the nation, it may not be the local councils that could use that trunk infrastructure funding, but that trunk infrastructure is really what would help, impact on delivery of housing in Australia. We're a very willing partner, but we can't do it alone. We need consistent and sustained investment and cooperation across all levels of government. Another example in Gladstone is we have about 7,000 lots approved, ready to go on the market. There's two reasons that the housing isn't being built, and it's not because no one wants to live here. I can tell you now, with what's going on in Gladstone, people want to move here. But what we're finding is, firstly, the cost of building a house in Gladstone, 4 bedrooms, about $650,000. That's $100,000 more than in Brisbane. And the further west you go and more remote you go, like Palm Island or Torres Strait, obviously, it gets even more expensive than that. And west is the same. So that's the first thing. And the other thing is developers are drip feeding the market. There's no denying that. They drip feed the market because that benefits them in terms of their profitability, and no one can argue with them on that. I'm more than happy to answer questions, but I might throw to our CEOs in the room who can go into more detail. Thank you.
Thank you. And happy to do that. So go ahead. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much. As Matt has pointed out, councils are managers of local places, so place-based policy is at their heart, and the level of government that people turn to in a crisis. They are under pressure with the housing shortages, and they are under pressure when these shortages are exacerbated through natural disasters. Councils are primarily responsible for providing a wide range of critical local area services. So when we're thinking about planning, we're also thinking about libraries, waste management for the infrastructure provision, the roads that take people in and out of their houses, as well as water and wastewater in many regional areas. These are all required by local communities and are all part of the complex housing puzzle. We acknowledge federal, state and territory governments are ultimately responsible for ensuring that households have access to housing that meets their needs and that they can afford it. We're in a really complex federated puzzle right here, and local government is often at the brunt of Commonwealth in terms of where the funding might come from, states and territories in terms of the planning regulations on top of them. Nevertheless, they do their best to do the hard lifting in their communities to deliver affordable housing despite being financially constrained, potentially working in cost-shifting environments. They can be subject to rate capping and they can be subject to rate concessions for community housing, which can make further service delivery difficult. While council planning controls play an important part, some councils note that developers have not taken up the opportunity for greater density in their areas within their planning provisions. The development feasibility, the lower land values, the shortage of appropriate skills and development in the industry, and sometimes the barrier to small investors has been identified as some of the underlying issues. Councils face declining revenue. We talk about financial sustainability of councils a lot. At this very moment, there's a financial sustainability, an inquiry into the financial sustainability of local government, and housing should be part of that discussion. I'm sure it's part of many of the submissions. We need that financial sustainability. We need to address the impost that comes from state-imposed rate pegging or state capping. We need to provide relief from rates and other fees when we are taking that step above and beyond to deliver community housing. We need an increased demand for local services. So how do we meet the needs of these people who are coming into the communities? This is what local government has at its front of mind. Need to look at the ageing population, the type of housing stock that they need, and how councils can meet the service delivery requirements for an ageing population. And you will hear us talk a lot about the infrastructure backlog. So the imperative nature of council, as Matt has already said, trunk infrastructure, how we bring the service delivery to the housing blocks, how we bring that to our communities. So it's a very complex puzzle. You've probably already heard that today.
Thank you very much, Ms Crawford, and thank you, Mayor Burnett, as well. I'll go to you for questions, Senator Pocock.
Thank you very much for your time here, Mr. Burnett. Hope you're healing well. Ms Crawford, you mentioned it being a federated puzzle. Mr. Burnett, you said we need consistent, sustained investment. Just how important it is for housing supply policies to be coordinated across all levels of government, federal, state and territory, and then council.
Do you want to kick off, Matt?
Yeah, I will. And Amy might be able to answer the question around the ministerial councils. We sit on a number of ministerial councils, and I guess one of them, housing, is a very important one that we don't sit on, if I'm correct, Amy. I've only just taken on the role of president, so we sit on a lot of ministerial councils, and it's very important to have our local government at the table at many of these meetings, and housing this should be one of those. I guess I also with National Cabinet as well. Elga has a position on National Cabinet, but I'm only invited once a year, and I think our National Cabinet meets 4 times a year. The current government, when in opposition, made a commitment to put local government at the table, and we're only going to be invited to be at the table once a year. And housing is a national issue that needs to be addressed, as you said, Senator, at all levels of government, and you need local government at the table. Like I said earlier, we're the ones who, in most cases, approve or refuse subdivisions and developments. They absolutely need to be part of the conversation, and obviously the government also have committed to a plan. When we've been involved in that, we just haven't seen the outcomes of that yet, and we're looking forward to seeing some recommendations from that, because this is a couple of years in the waiting. Mm-hmm. Amy?
Yeah, absolutely. And from the federated model point of view, we acknowledge we live in the realms of the Constitution. So federated model is here to stay. And so that even brings more of an imperative for the federal government to show a leadership role in terms of what a national plan for housing and homelessness would look like. We were grateful we were involved in early consultations with Department of Social Services. And as Matt said, we'd like to see that. We do acknowledge that there is a place-based nature to planning, rules and regulations. So local decisions are best made at that local level. And so the complexity of having local governments need to plan for their communities, understand the need for their communities, does mean that it remains in that jigsaw puzzle. And I don't think we'll ever get away from things being in a jigsaw puzzle. It's about us trying to work together.
And when it comes to housing policy, one of my frustrations in here is that it's split between Treasury, DSS, Housing Australia, infrastructure, and you're often in this blame game with people pointing fingers at, well, that's their job, I don't do this bit, they do this bit. I think more broadly, when it comes to housing policies and the lack of supply, we also see a bit of a blame game between the Commonwealth, states and territories and councils. And from what I hear, you guys bear the brunt of criticisms. I'm wondering how that feels, and if you think it's fair that councils are sort of being blamed for the lack of supply.
I'll go again because I just recently commented, I think it was in the Australian, might have been the Financial Review, on exactly that, saying we need to stop the blame game. It's quite easy to blame the councils, particularly when you've got elections coming up, state and federal elections. It's easy to blame the council because people know that it's the local government that might approve or refuse these things. But as I said earlier, for us, we have in Gladstone almost 7,000 lots ready to go. And there's a house goes on the market in Gladstone, it can be sold within 24 hours, or if it's on there for more than a week, there's something wrong with it, and so or it's overpriced. And that's not unique to Gladstone. That's happening right across the country, as you be aware. We're more than willing to be part of the solution. We're not the problem. The local government can be part of the solution, and we're more willing and able to be involved. I've said since being elected Elder President many times, we want local solutions to national issues, and we're more than willing to be involved in any way we can.
And the blame game, it often falls to quite wide-reaching problems that Australia is facing. Skills shortages. Just recently, in 2022, the skills shortages were shown for local councils in engineers, urban and town planners and building surveyors. The very people we need to make this work happen. We also see that we've put a big call out for enabling infrastructure. So the sewer works, the water works that go in, the road works that need to go into developments before they happen. That is a really large bill. It's a really large bill, and there's a tendency to not want to pass that on to the buyer, and totally appreciate trying to keep cost of houses down. So who's left holding that bill? How do we make sure we have proper infrastructure going into those areas? Our research shows there's a $6 billion shortfall just in reaching the big housing target that is currently at play. So, we need to set aside the blame game and take a more broader look at what's at play.
One of the things that we were discussing earlier is the sort of short-term nature of the focus in politics. Election cycles, changes in government mean that often if whole policies are just discarded, or the good ones are sort of rebranded and the new party tries to make them theirs. One of the intentions behind this bill before the Senate is to actually have legislated a 10-year plan that provides certainty to all stakeholders, the Commonwealth, state and territories, local governments. What do you see? I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on that and some of the potential benefits or downfalls of having a longer term plan.
The potential, I'll kick off, sorry Matt. You go. There is a potential benefit in having a longer term view. We've seen a longer term view in the 1.2 million, the housing target. Perhaps where that has shown a downfall is if you don't have that constructive conversation at the beginning on the how it's going to happen, you can lead to quite rapid decisions being made. We're seeing that upon our councils at the moment with targets, and the potential downfall in not allowing that flexibility at the local level and a real understanding of what that community will need and bringing your community on the journey. I think too often there's this fear of the NIMBY, not in my backyard, but planning rules and regulations and discussions with community is about helping them understand the broader problem. So one concern in that very long-term view could be that you lose the flexibility along the way to respond to whatever the global conditions are. So I know there's a global shortage of urban and town planners. So there are things absolutely outside of even our nation's control. I understand there's movement afoot to try and encourage them in, but I am concerned a super long view can detract from flexibility. Matt, anything you'd add?
Well, from a local council point of view, I've been on my local council for 24 years, and that's not uncommon for councillors around the country to be elected for a long time. So at a local government level, we're, sorry to say, but we more often think beyond one term. I made a decision as a councillor, a young councillor in my early 20s in the year 2000 to build a port access road because I knew it would free up our waterfront precinct. And that happened in about 2018, so about 18 years later. It finally happened and came to fruition. I encourage you to come to Gladstone and check it out. But sometimes at a local level, it's a lot easier to plan beyond the 4-year election cycle because you're closest to the communities. I don't know about Canberra or the state governments because, and you'll appreciate this, Senator, there's not a lot of independents there. Obviously, they might vote on party lines at times, either side of the House. And it can be about an election cycle, and we certainly need, I guess, not just legislation, but we need policies that are put in place that go beyond the current government and the next government and the next government.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, and that concludes the questions that the committee has for you today. Thank you very much for giving your evidence today. You go with our thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just take a brief suspension while we invite our next witnesses up, so that the committee is suspended. I'll just note for those in the room, we're still seeing the suspension screen, but the committee resumes. Thank you. The committee resumes, and I now welcome officials from the Department of Social Services and the Department of Treasury. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. The Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. Commonwealth officers appearing today are also reminded of the Senate order specifying the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised. A copy of the order is available from Secretariat. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
Karen Crosswaite, First Assistant Secretary, Housing Division, Treasury.
Kath Payton, Acting Group Manager for Pensions, Housing and Homelessness.
And Matt Flavel, Deputy Secretary, Department of Social Services.
Great. Thanks for being with us. Did any of you have an opening statement, or shall we proceed to questions? Senator Pocock.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for your time here this morning. My understanding is that work on a national housing and homelessness plan began sort of about 12 months ago. Can you confirm when that work started?
I can get you the specific date, but it was in the latter part of last year, that's correct. And then sort of went into the early part of this calendar year, particularly with a focus on an extensive range of consultation with stakeholders.
And why is a national plan needed?
Well, I think this was articulated by the government in their election commitment that they made, that, you know, there is benefit in having a more strategic approach to lining up all the various levels of government and policies that can deliver better housing outcomes for people across the housing spectrum. I don't have the specific words in front of me, but I mean, I'm trying to give you the sort of the feel for you know, the benefits of having a plan.
Thank you. And if it was an election commitment, why did DSS only start this work at the end of last year?
Well, I wouldn't say, I mean, start is probably a bit strong. I think that the formal phase of it, in other words, the consultation with stakeholders occurred in the latter part of last year. Okay. But the planning around it certainly occurred much earlier than that. And my recollection is that, you know, there's discussion about the development of it at the housing ministers' meetings that took place during the course of 2023. So it certainly wasn't a case of waiting or pushing it off. But in terms of the kind of the public-facing bit, that was more the latter part of last year.
And states and territories' involvement in the plan, how has that worked? And are they happy with having a national plan?
Well, what I'd say is it has been discussed at housing ministers' meetings. In fact, I think that's been referenced in the communiques that have come out. I can't speak to individual state and territories' views on it, other than to say I haven't seen them coming out saying that a plan's a bad idea or that they're not going to participate in the process. There's been quite strong collaboration between the Commonwealth and jurisdictions in the development of the plan. They're a different type of key stakeholder, obviously. So there's the broader community and representative groups and a range of people who have views. And then the states, of course, with very important roles, because in a lot of cases they are the primary level of government that's actually delivering the services or responsible for the policies on particular aspects of housing. And
after all the work that you're putting into this plan, if it's not legislated, how easy is it for a future government to sort of simply just discard it and put it in the bin?
Well, I guess what I'd say is if a plan is developed and has the support of stakeholders and state governments, I guess in theory things can always be junked, but actually, you know, in those circumstances, I would have thought that was a bit of an unusual outcome.
And when will it be completed?
So that's really a matter for the minister and the government in terms of timing. I can't really give any more updates on that. All I would say is that as a national plan, obviously more recently we've had a change in housing minister, and the housing minister's been certainly working very hard across a range of different parts of the housing portfolio. And this is one part of that. But also we have seen, of course, at state and territory level, elections and sometimes caretaker periods can make it difficult to get agreement of all states and territories. So I think that process is ongoing. But in terms of when it will be released, you know, that's really a matter I have to leave to the minister and the government.
And so if it's a matter for government, I'm taking it that DSS have sort of done all the work and it's actually ready to go, and it's now up to the government to decide when to sort of put it through cabinet and announce it?
Well, I won't talk to the specifics, but what I'd say is that public-facing consultation part has been done. there have been discussions with the states and territories. In terms of the final form, that's ultimately a matter for government in terms of the content, the process for gaining formal agreement from states and territories, all of those things.
And in terms of detail, I take it you have presented to the Minister with a plan that you think is sort of ready to go, and it's up to them to either ask for revisions or put that to National Cabinet and get the sort of stamp of approval?
It's more that it continues to be iterated, I guess.
But at some point, so have you put forward something that's just a draft, or I understand this iteration, but that's surely that's a cabinet decision at some point.
Yeah, and I'm not going to talk about where individual components are up to in terms of preserving that relationship we have with the Minister about where, what we have and haven't put forward. I think though, in, iterating, one of the things that is hard to miss is that there's been, it's almost hard to keep up with the range of different policies that governments, both Commonwealth and state and territory, are announcing, literally every week in order to ensure that there's policies and programs in place to deal with some of the housing challenges. And so a plan actually does need to be iterated quite constantly to take effect of that. We've seen it in the last week, as you'd be aware, changes passed through the New South Wales Parliament, for instance, that actually provide greater protection for renters there. And so I guess I use that word iterate because in order to be reflective, it's not a draft and then kind of sits and is waiting for cabinet approval. It's much more a sort of back and forward sort of continuous state of drafting, often reflecting the fact that there's changes in policies, and obviously to the extent there are changes in governments at state and territory level, needs to reflect, the views of that government who will ultimately want to sign up to it and be part of the plan.
No, I totally take your point. It's been well made in this committee hearing today that one of the issues is that there's just this raft of policy announcements and a lack of coordination. And I understand, you could for the next 10 years in the background be updating this national plan, but that no one's ever seen. And so I guess I'm keen to actually see the government bring forward the plan. One of the things I was interested that's also come up in submissions and in the hearings is whether you've considered population growth and immigration settings in developing the plan.
I might defer. I don't know that it's been. It may have been right. So we published a consultation summary earlier in the year. I'd have to go and check to what extent some of those issues were sort of raised by stakeholders in that as part of the summary document that was produced.
How can population immigration not be part of the National Housing and Homelessness Plan, given the impact that it has on housing availability, affordability?
Yeah, I think what we would expect is that a national plan for ensuring that there is enough high-quality housing for all Australians would need to take account of what that demand side would look like, and one of the very significant drivers of that is migration. Population is obviously a really an overarching one. I would not expect, though, the housing plan to be the government's overarching public-facing statement of intent and strategy around that. There is a migration strategy. The government has its own policy objectives around population, which would sit outside of the housing plan. But you're right in that it is an absolutely relevant consideration that does needs to be cognisant of what the population drivers might be that would drive the need for housing. So that's something that we're very, very alive to. The extent to which the national plan also provides a framework for ensuring that there's enough housing and that the housing targets are appropriate and are able to be met does sort of implicitly take account of what the population drivers might be behind that.
I guess I'm interested, like, where is the plan around population? Because I've heard in the ESOS bill inquiry that the government doesn't actually set any net overseas migration targets. Treasury just issues forecasts. Is that correct?
That is my understanding. I'm not responsible for population policy, so I'd need to defer to my colleagues back in Treasury who are. But it is my understanding that the government sets makes forecasts. It doesn't set targets for NOM.
I guess I'm concerned. We've got so many Australians doing it tough. We hear that this isn't in the plan, the National Housing and Homelessness Plan. When it comes to Treasury, there's actually no plan in terms of migration and population. And I take it that that's not your area. But on housing in Treasury, I'm saying there's about 70 staff working on housing policy in Treasury. Is that roughly correct?
It's a lower number than 70. I think it's more like 50.
Okay. Maybe just on notice if you're happy to.
Happy to get you that number.
If maybe on headcount and FTE, if that's all right. Has Treasury had input on the draft National Housing and Homelessness Plan?
Yeah, we've been working really closely with DSS.
Mm-hmm. Which parts of the plan has Treasury been?
We've been working with them closely on all of it, but I'd say elements of the plan that deal with housing supply and affordability have been where Treasury's focus has been, which is in line with the split of responsibilities between the two departments.
And what's the interaction between supply and affordability and net overseas migration and total population?
Sorry, what do you mean?
Well, how does net overseas migration and population affect supply and affordability? You said you'd been working on supply and affordability.
To the extent that that's what's reflected in the plan, we have. If you're asking what the impact of net overseas migration and population is on housing affordability more generally, it is population growth is the key demand driver that is creating one of the issues with affordability for housing in Australia at the moment at a sort of macro level. But we've been working with DSS on the way that the plan can set out a vision and a plan for addressing housing affordability through the levers that all levels of government have. So I won't go to the specifics of what the content is, as Mr. Flavel's already alluded to.
If that's the case, though, then are you not concerned that population isn't actually part of the National Housing and Homelessness Plan if it's the biggest driver on accessibility and affordability of housing?
The population has a really significant impact on housing affordability, but it is also population and migration specifically also have a really big impact on other aspects of the economy. So it would be, as I've said earlier, the housing and homelessness plan is not where I would expect to see the government stating its overarching policy around migration and population.
Where does that sit?
That would be responsibility of the Department of Home Affairs.
Home Affairs, okay. Back to DSS, if I can ask about how the government's National Housing and Homelessness Plan conforms to the framework set out in the bill that we're discussing today.
Sorry, how the plan that the government is drafting
conforms to some of the principles and objectives of the bill before the Senate?
I'm not sure I can give the technical answer, but I think that, in reading the bill is about legislating a plan and then having some additional, what I might call kind of governance arrangements around that, in terms of both a sort of a consumer panel to take on board the views of various consumer stakeholders, and then a housing advocate, or whatever the name is, in terms of, I guess, providing analysis and advice. I just observe it as we can give you the data on which, how many and which bodies are being consulted in the development, but certainly in that consultation phase, we saw well over sort of 1,000 different interactions through various means, both submissions being provided, community forums, targeted consultations. So, the idea of actually listening to people who have specific needs or having direct input, I think has been a feature of the plan that the government's been doing. Not legislated, obviously, but pretty broad. And again, be happy to provide on notice the sorts of groups that have been consulted to give effect to that. In terms of the monitoring of the plan, well, I guess the threshold issue, of course, is a plan is one thing, but it's really the actions and policies that kind of then go to that. And that's the bit that I think is, there's a range of people who will look at what the government is doing at the federal level and what states and territories are doing and whether they're actually doing it and achieving it. I think what's been significant over the past few years is we actually have seen the government commit to particular targets. So through the Accord, the 1.2 million houses, particular targets that were set as part of the HAF arrangements for social and affordable housing, and other mechanisms and I think that that setting of targets or kind of implied performance indicators means that you can get a variety of ways in which the Senate and a whole lot of people can actually take a look and say, well, is this actually achieving what it's meant to do? And in what way is it contributing to some of those higher level goals around having a plan, which is, better coordination, better outcomes for particular segments of the community. Whether that should just be invested in one person or a range, well, that's an open question, but I don't think that the plan and development by the government currently precludes, necessarily leads to a diminished outcome.
Thank you. That's useful. And how is it planned that the policy initiatives progressed under, you mentioned the National Housing Accord, the HAF, national housing agreements national cabinet agreements, on planning reform, rental regulations? How will they be integrated into the National Housing and Homelessness Plan?
Yeah, well, I assume they will be integrated in, but the question of how they're integrated in I can't really speak to given the stage of development and the government's still deciding about finalising and releasing a plan.
You mentioned the sort of comprehensive engagement you've had with stakeholders and others in developing the plan. One of the things this bill does, as you said, is sets up a consumer council and an advocate. Once the National Housing and Homelessness Plan is finally unveiled by the minister, what's the avenue for people to hold the government to account, to lobby, to make representations, given you said it's such an iterative process?
Well, I guess what I'd say is it's going to be a less formal process than simply having an advocate or a council. People will actually, in different parts of the housing spectrum, posit their own views about whether the policies being implemented are doing enough to alleviate the issues. So, and as you know, there are a range of different stakeholders here. The homelessness and, at different points in the housing spectrum, there are a range of different stakeholders, and I think it's appropriate to allow all of them to have their say in respect of the policies that kind of matter most to them.
And given we had sort of this early draft, and now it's been a long time with the department, will there be another opportunity for consultation for stakeholders to see a draft before it's finalised, or will it just be unveiled?
I can't really speak to what those are quite legitimately decisions of the Minister and Cabinet about what process they want to go through to finalise that.
Surely from a DSS perspective, though, you have a view, or is this very much it's finished, it's with Cabinet, it's up to them?
As I said, I'm not giving any indications about where the actual plan is up to. But
why is that? Sorry.
Well, because it's ultimately a matter for the government as to how they decide to finalise it and when to release it.
But can I just seek clarification? My understanding is that you can ask questions about the status of work. The only time that there's no answers is that when it is Cabinet in confidence, when it's been presented to the government. Am I wrong there?
It's traditionally a bit broader than that. Senator Pocock and officials often will say that the answer to the question would require them to disclose advice to government, and that's generally considered to be an answer that's acceptable for officials to give. But you can put your questions and seek answers.
Sure. I guess I just hear from stakeholders that there was an early draft, there were concerns that some of the stuff that had been raised in consultations, like issues around our tax system, capital gains tax, discounts, weren't really reflected in what people had heard in the consultation, and now it's essentially a black box. And there's an anxiety that, are we just going to get, a big unveiling of a plan that we have to live with, or if the experts in this are going to actually have another say and say, well, this is really good, we could improve it here. Have you thought of this? Why isn't this reflected? That was my only question, but I understand if you can't answer it. Just to clarify on the state and territory consultation, have they been part of a sort of formal consultation with the department, or was that just left for National Cabinet?
No, it's just a different form. So the consultation, I guess, is best thought of in two really broad parts. One was a public consultation, so the call for submissions, a range of targeted consultations with stakeholders. And there we saw individuals and a range of different stakeholders who you would expect to be putting forward views. I mean, a national plan obviously means that the states and territories have some ownership of it, and so they are consulted in a different way, both through discussions at ministerial council meetings, and then obviously would have the opportunity to have input into the plan in a more direct way.
Have local government been consulted?
Yes, they have, Senator.
What did that process look like? Was it through the Australian Local Government Association, or was it broader with individual
It was through the
councils?
Local Government Association. They came to we might have done it online with them, and they spoke directly to us.
Okay. And they were shown the draft, or what is that?
No, that was in the process of getting ideas from people.
Okay.
And Senator, sorry, on that point, so there's the consultation at national level, but I mean, if you look at the organisations who went to community consultations, I'm just looking down my list here, you've got, Surf Coast Shire Council. So it is a combination, I think, of both dealing with the Local Government Association at the national level, and then some individual councils have obviously gone along to community consultations or provided submissions as well as part of that process.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. That concludes the questions that we have for you, and that concludes today's hearing. Thank you to all witnesses who appeared, and to Hansard and Broadcasting for their assistance. The committee has agreed that responses to questions or notice should be provided by Tuesday the 5th of November. The committee now stands adjourned. Thank you.